The handcuffs closed with a sound that did not belong in that room. It was a sharp mechanical click, the kind of sound that had echoed through that precinct hundreds of times over 17 years, always in the same direction, always meaning the same thing, always belonging to the same man who was now standing with his wrists locked behind his back in the center of his own booking room, while the fluorescent lights hummed overhead and every computer screen in the building glowed the same identical, unblinking red. The federal seal of the Department of Justice filled every monitor in Fairview Heights Municipal Police Department, from the dispatch desk to the captain's private terminal to the evidence locker intake station. And the officers who had not been escorted out were standing very still with their hands visible, doing the math on what that seal meant for them personally and not arriving at any comfortable answers. Dale Pruitt was shaking. Not the theatrical shaking of a man performing distress for an audience, but the deep bone-level trembling of a man whose body has processed a truth that his mind is still refusing, the shaking of a man who has spent 17 years being the largest, most dangerous thing in every room he walked into, and has just discovered with sudden and total finality that he was never that at all. His hands, those thick-fingered, heavy hands that had spent the better part of 2 decades pressing people against car hoods and chain-link fences and wooden benches, were splayed open behind his back in the involuntary posture of a man trying to grab onto something that is not there. And there was nothing there, and Dale Pruitt's knees were doing something complicated that required visible effort to control. 3 men in dark suits stood at the exits, not blocking them dramatically, but simply occupying them the way professionals occupy space, with the quiet sufficiency of people who have already accounted for every variable in the room and found nothing that requires additional action. Near the far wall beside the wooden bench that was bolted to the baseboard with the kind of institutional permanence that suggested it had always been there and always would be, a 17-year-old boy stood in a rain-damp hoodie with an aluminum equipment case at his feet, and he was watching all of this with eyes that were calm in a way that had nothing to do with indifference, and everything to do with the discipline that had been built into him over years of careful, loving, terrified preparation. His wrists bore 2 red marks where the steel had been too tight, and he was not crying, and he was not gloating, and he had not said a single word since the federal agents arrived, because there was nothing left for him to say, and he had known that for some time. 2 hours ago, Dale Pruitt had believed this boy was the easiest collar he had made all month. He had been wrong about that in a way that was going to cost him the rest of his functional life. And the story of exactly how wrong he was begins at 11:47 on a rainy Thursday night on a street that Pruitt had spent 17 years believing was his. The rain had been falling since 9 o'clock, the kind of steady, unhurried rain that settles in over a suburb and makes the streetlights look soft and the empty roads look like mirrors. And Marcus Webb was driving home at 11:47 with both hands on the wheel, and his speed set exactly 3 miles per hour below the posted limit, which was not caution born of nerves, but discipline born of something closer to survival training. He was 17 years old, 5 feet 11 inches, and quiet in the particular way that made adults at Fairview Heights Academy use words like thoughtful and focused in his progress reports, while the same quietness made certain parents in the school parking lot use words they did not say aloud, but communicated clearly enough through the particular quality of their attention when Marcus passed by with his equipment case and his backpack and his unhurried stride. Fairview Heights was the kind of town that had perfected the art of looking like it had nothing to prove where the lawns were kept at a height that suggested professional maintenance rather than personal effort, where the sidewalks had no cracks, where the gas station on the corner was the architectural equivalent of an apology for being commercial, where the phrase good neighborhood was used often and always by people who meant something specific by it that they declined to specify. Marcus was one of 4 black students in the advanced STEM program at Fairview Heights Academy, a distinction he had not chosen and could not set down, and he carried the weight of being exceptional in a space that had not planned on him with the practiced steadiness of someone who has learned to treat exhaustion as a background condition rather than an event. He had spent 6 hours in the school's basement lab that evening, crouched over a folding table with his 2 teammates finalizing the calibration on the autonomous aerial mapping drone that their team had been building for 11 weeks in preparation for the state qualifier 2 days away. And his back ached, and his eyes were gritty, and he wanted nothing more complicated than his own bed. But he was driving home with both hands on the wheel and his speed set 3 miles per hour below the limit, because his father had taught him that the distance between a safe night and a dangerous one was often nothing more than the discipline to do every small thing correctly, even when you were tired. The equipment case on the back seat was an aluminum hard case, reinforced at the corners with a combination lock on the main latch and a smaller secondary latch on the accessory compartment, and inside it, nested in custom-cut foam that Marcus had spent an afternoon shaping precisely to fit, were the components that represented 11 weeks of work. Circuit boards, wiring harnesses, lithium battery packs, a flight controller module, calibration tools, and at the center of the foam arrangement, a gyroscopic stabilization module that his father had brought home 3 weeks ago in a plain brown shipping envelope and placed on the kitchen counter with the words, "This should help with your wind compensation problem and nothing further." The module was heavier than anything Marcus had sourced commercially, and its housing was a matte black alloy that did not reflect light the way commercial components did. And the serial number on its underside was a sequence of letters and numbers that Marcus had occasionally wondered about in the abstract way you wonder about the details of a parent's work when the work is vague by design. On the inner foam of the case near the hinge, there was a small adhesive sticker, faded but legible. The kind of sticker that institutional inventory departments produce by the thousands with a code printed in a sans serif font that Marcus had never thought to question. Because equipment came with stickers, and stickers meant nothing to a kid who was focused on wind compensation algorithms and flight path optimization. He noticed the cruiser idling in the shadow of the pharmacy awning before it even moved, because his father had taught him to notice, and for a moment he held the specific hope of every tired black kid driving through a white suburb late at night. The hope that is not really hope, but more of a prayer addressed to no one in particular, the prayer that says, "Not tonight. Please, not tonight." And for exactly 4 seconds the cruiser did not move, and the prayer seemed to be working. Then the headlights came on, and Marcus took one slow breath and put his hands precisely at 10 and 2. The interior of Dale Pruitt's cruiser smelled like the inside of a life that had curdled slowly over a long time. Like old fast food wrappers compressed under the passenger seat, like the stale residue of cigarettes smoked with the windows up, because the department had a policy about smoking in vehicles, and Dale had a policy about department policies that amounted to a studied and practiced indifference, like the particular bitterness of coffee that had been sitting in a dented stainless thermos since the start of the shift, and was now the temperature of mild disappointment. Dale Pruitt was 46 years old and had been a patrolman with the Fairview Heights Police Department for 17 years, which was not a career so much as a territory, because the distinction between the two had dissolved for Dale sometime around his 5th year on the force, when he had noticed that the people who complained about him never seemed to get anywhere, and the people who praised him kept getting promoted, and he had filed that information in the part of his brain reserved for things that confirmed what he had already decided was true. He was broad in the chest and thicker in the gut than he had been at 30, with a neck that sat on his shoulders like something load-bearing, and a face that had the particular redness of a man who spent a lot of time outdoors being angry, and a habit so ingrained it had crossed the threshold from behavior into reflex of hooking his right thumb over his belt buckle whenever he was about to assert something. The gesture preceding confrontation, the way a conductor raises a baton before the first note, unconscious and total and utterly characteristic. He had built his career on a philosophy that he stated openly to the rookies he trained and occasionally allowed to himself when no one was in the car, and the philosophy was this: Fairview Heights did not have a crime problem because he did not let it have one, and his job was not public service, it was maintenance, and maintenance meant knowing who belonged and who did not, and acting accordingly before the situation required more effort than it was worth. The 9 complaints filed against him over 15 years were a point of quiet pride rather than concern, because all 9 had been reviewed by Captain Roy Simmons, and all 9 had been closed without finding. And Dale had played golf with Roy Simmons on 4 occasions and shared a table with him at the department's annual banquet for 11 consecutive years, and understood that the relationship between a captain who needed clean statistics and an officer who delivered them was a relationship that had its own grammar of protection and reciprocity that did not need to be discussed to be understood. There was also the group chat, which had been running for 3 years on an encrypted messaging app that 12 officers in the South Corridor used on their personal phones, and the group chat had a name that Dale had chosen, South Corridor Watch, and it had a culture that Dale had established which included a vocabulary for describing the residents who drove through the demographic shift at the southern edge of the city line that would have ended every career in it instantly if it had ever been read by anyone outside those 12 phones. And it also had a point system, informal and unwritten but universally understood, which tracked the number of stops made on drivers who fit a particular profile in the corridor, and Dale was currently leading the monthly standings by a comfortable margin. He saw the Civic come through the intersection at Elm and Morrison at 11:47, and he did not consciously decide to follow it. So much as his body made the decision before his mind could review the reasoning, the way an appetite works and the reasoning assembled after the fact was familiar and well practiced. The car was older, the hour was late, the driver was young, the hoodie was dark, and nobody drove the speed limit unless they were hiding something. He pulled the plates and the system returned a clean registration under a David Webb. And he scoffed at the screen because a clean registration was exactly what a careful person would have. And Dale had always believed that caution was its own form of guilt, and he pulled out of the pharmacy shadow and fell in behind the Civic and waited for something he could use. He waited for 1.25 miles before the Civic's right front tire grazed the faded yellow center line on the curve near the old bank building. A deviation of perhaps 4 inches caused by a pothole that had been reported to Public Works 3 times without result. And Dale said the words to himself in the dark of the cruiser, the words he had been saying in some form for 17 years, his own private incantation of authority, not in my town, not at this hour. And his hand went to the light bar switch and the familiar warmth moved through his chest, the warmth of a man doing exactly what he believes he was put on this earth to do. He said them again as he approached the driver's window, leaning in with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who has arrived somewhere he believes he is owed. Not in my town, not at this hour. The words warm and familiar in his mouth and the dashcam on the cruiser's windshield recorded all of it with the blind, impartial efficiency of a machine that does not know whose side it is on. Marcus had the dome light on before Pruitt reached the window. He had done it in the sequence his father had drilled into him, the sequence that was less a procedure and more a liturgy. The rituals of a black boy in a white suburb performed not for his own comfort, but for the comfort of the person approaching to remove from that person every possible excuse for what the person might want to do. Anyway, Dome Light 4 windows down, despite the rain coming in at an angle. Keys removed from the ignition and placed flat on the dashboard where they could be seen. Both hands returned to the top of the steering wheel with the palms open, and then stillness. The particular controlled stillness of someone who has been taught that the way you hold your body in the next 30 seconds is a form of language that will be interpreted by someone who has already decided what it means. Pruitt came to the window from the rear, taking his time letting the cruiser's spotlight hold Marcus in its full intensity for an additional 20 seconds, before he moved the way you make someone stand in a line, when you have the power to make them stand in a line. And when he arrived at the driver's window, he leaned in with his forearm on the roof and the thumb hooked over the belt buckle, and the particular expression of a man who is performing competence for an audience that exists only in his own head. The voice was what Marcus had expected, not loud enough to be recorded as shouting, but sharp enough to carry the full weight of what it intended, the voice of someone who has practiced the specific art of contempt, delivered at a volume that sounds like professionalism. License, registration, proof of insurance. Pruitt said with the cadence of someone reading a list they have memorized and find tedious. And Marcus said clearly and without rushing that they were in the glove compartment and that he needed to reach across to get them, and he narrated every movement before he made it and handed the documents over with both hands visible. Pruitt took the license and held the pen light on it for longer than was necessary, reading the name with a deliberateness that was not about comprehension. And his eyes moved from the license to Marcus's face and back to the license, and then he glanced back at his cruiser's dash cam with the quick practiced awareness of a man who knows exactly what angle the camera covers. And when he looked back at Marcus, there was the beginning of a smile on his face, small and private. The smile of a man who has decided something and is comfortable with the decision. Marcus Webb. Pruitt said, chewing on it, and then he asked what a kid from out of the area was doing creeping around Fairview Heights at midnight, and Marcus said quietly that he had been at the high school working on a robotics project for the state qualifier, and that he was heading home. And Pruitt laughed in the way that some people use laughter as a weapon, short and dismissive, the laugh of a man who has already decided the answer and is performing disbelief for the record. And there was real enjoyment in the laugh, the particular pleasure of a man doing something he is good at. The questions that followed were not questions in any investigative sense. They were a performance of suspicion designed to produce the discomfort and anger that would justify the next step. And Marcus answered each one with the same quiet precision, the same steady voice, the same refusal to provide the emotional reaction that Pruitt was fishing for because his father had told him, "They want you angry. They want you scared. They want any version of you that is not this calm, because this calm is the thing they cannot process and the thing they cannot use." Pruitt ordered Marcus out of the car, and Marcus complied immediately, unbuckling and stepping into the rain without protest, standing with his hands visible at his sides, and Pruitt moved around him and used his body the way he had been using his body for 17 years. Placing himself close enough that Marcus had to make a conscious choice not to step back, asserting physical space as a form of ownership, and the thumb was over the belt buckle, and the expression had settled into something that was comfortable and practiced and entirely satisfied with itself. The pat-down was performed with unnecessary force hands, slapping against pockets and waistband with the efficiency of someone making a point rather than conducting a search. And Marcus said clearly that he did not consent to any search, and Pruitt said with the ease of a man reciting something he has said hundreds of times, that he had probable cause that Marcus was driving erratically, and matched the description of a string of residential burglaries in the sector, which was a lie assembled in the moment from the available materials of his own imagination, built with the practiced speed of someone who has been constructing probable cause from nothing for the better part of 2 decades. The search produced nothing which produced in Pruitt not the relief of a man who has confirmed that a citizen is not a criminal, but the frustration of a man who has been denied something he felt entitled to. And he moved to the car and opened the rear door without asking, and Marcus watched from the curb with the quiet burning indignation of someone who knows that the correct response to a thing that is wrong is not always to say that it is wrong. The aluminum case came out of the back seat and hit the wet asphalt with a sound that made Marcus's stomach contract, the particular sound of precision equipment meeting a surface it was not designed to meet. And Pruitt stood over it with his thumbs hooked in his belt and looked down at it. And what was on his face in that moment was not the professional assessment of a law enforcement officer, examining potential evidence, but something warmer and more personal than that. The expression of a man who has found exactly what he came looking for, and is taking a moment to appreciate it before he uses it. "That is school property," Marcus said, "and it contains delicate electronic equipment," and he said that he did not consent to the case being opened, and Pruitt looked at him with the expression of a man being told something charming by someone who does not understand how anything works. And then he crouched down and set his fingers on the latches and paused there in that crouched position and looked up at Marcus with the small, deliberate smile of a man who wants his audience to watch what he is about to do. He held the pause for 3 full seconds, looking directly at Marcus's face, reading it the way a person reads a face when they are doing something they know causes pain and want to confirm that the pain is landing, and then he popped the latches and opened the case. The contents were illuminated by the cruiser's spotlight in the flat white light that makes everything look either clinical or criminal, depending on what you are looking for. And Pruitt was not looking for a robotics project, so what he saw was not a robotics project, and he began picking up components one at a time and holding them toward the light and narrating his interpretation for the dash cam with the confidence and visible relish of a man who is performing a role he has played many times and has never once been interrupted in the middle of it. The gyroscopic module sat in the center of the foam at the bottom of the case mat, black and heavy, and sealed with a manufacturing precision that had no analog in anything available at a consumer electronics retailer. And when Pruitt picked it up, he turned it over in his hands and felt the weight of it, and the small, satisfied smile widened by a degree, and he set it down on the wet asphalt instead of back in the foam, setting it down with the specific care of someone who knows that where they place an object is itself a message. He stood up and looked at Marcus and said the words again, leaning toward Marcus so that Marcus could smell the stale coffee on his breath close enough that it was a deliberate invasion, and his voice carried the warm satisfaction of a man arriving at the conclusion of a story he wrote himself, not in my town, not at this hour, and definitely not with this. He announced the arrest with the same ease possession of burglary tools, suspicion of grand larceny, and Marcus said for what? And his eyes were wide with a specific kind of grief. The grief of a person who has prepared for something for a long time and still finds that the preparation does not prevent the thing from hurting when it arrives, and Pruitt said, take your pick with the cheerful pragmatism of a man who does not need to justify himself and has never been required to. The handcuffs went on with 2 extra clicks past the necessary point, and Pruitt stepped back to look at Marcus in the cruiser's spotlight, with the expression of a man checking his own work and finding it satisfactory. And there was a softness in his face in that moment that was more disturbing than anger would have been the softness of a man who is exactly where he wants to be, doing exactly what he wants to do, and feels that the world has been correctly arranged. In the case on the asphalt, the anti-tamper housing of the gyroscopic module had sustained a hairline fracture from Pruitt's handling a crack that was invisible to the eye and irreversible in its consequences. And inside the housing, a fail-safe protocol that had been engineered with the assumption that any unauthorized breach meant hostile action had activated a silent, irreversible memory wipe that would complete in 40 minutes. And simultaneously, a secondary beacon embedded in the module's housing had transmitted a single encrypted pulse to a server that was not in any civilian communications network. Pruitt's cruiser pulled away from the empty street, and the flickering street lamp was left alone over the wet asphalt, and the equipment case was left open on the ground for Officer Kevin Sharp to collect when he arrived, and the faded government asset sticker on the inner foam caught the light for a moment before Sharp's flashlight passed over it, and Sharp photographed it without knowing why, only knowing that something about it bothered him in a way he could not yet name. Sharp photographed the asset tag at 12:17, crouching over the open case in the rain with his department-issue phone and the flashlight wedged under his arm. And the tag was small, faded at the edges, the kind of sticker that institutional inventory systems produce by the thousands, and that accumulates on equipment that moves through official hands, without accumulating on equipment that was bought at a consumer electronics retailer or a university supply catalog. He had worked with Pruitt for 2 years, and in those 2 years he had learned to follow without questioning, because questioning cost more than it returned. But there was something about the tag, a specific combination of the letter, number prefix, and the formatting of the inventory code that snagged on something in Sharp's memory, the way a splinter catches fabric. And he photographed it, and then photographed it again from a closer angle, and then closed the case, and carried it to the evidence intake desk at the Fairview Heights precinct, and said nothing to Pruitt about the photograph because he did not know yet what the photograph meant, and he was the kind of person who needed to know what something meant before he introduced it into a conversation. Inside the case, in the center of the custom-cut foam, the gyroscopic module was continuing its work. The hairline fracture had not been enough to breach the inner housing, which meant the core data chip was intact. But the fail-safe protocol did not require a full breach to activate only an unauthorized pressure event on the anti-tamper casing, and Pruitt's handling had constituted an unauthorized pressure event with a margin to spare, and so the internal memory wipe was progressing through its 40-minute cycle with the patient indifferent efficiency of a system designed to protect information that had a higher value than the equipment containing it. Simultaneously, the secondary beacon had completed its transmission approximately 4 minutes after the crack in the casing, a single encrypted pulse containing 3 pieces of information: the asset identification number, the GPS coordinates of the Fairview Heights Municipal Police Department parking lot, and a status code that, translated in plain language to classified asset, has been handled by unauthorized personnel in a law enforcement context. Family emergency protocol may apply. That pulse had traveled through a satellite relay to a receiving station, and from the receiving station to a server, and from the server to a secure terminal in a building in Langley, Virginia, where a duty officer named Torres was reviewing a logistics brief at 12:21 in the morning when the terminal produced a soft alert tone that he had been trained to treat as the highest priority item in any given shift regardless of whatever else was in front of him. Torres pulled up the asset file, cross-referenced the identification number, and found himself reading the service record of a directorate-level operations coordinator with 22 years of field and administrative experience currently assigned to domestic reassignment under a civilian cover identity, and the asset tag was registered under a code name that Torres recognized because everyone in the operations division recognized it, and there was a family emergency protocol attached to the file that was distinct from the standard emergency protocols. In one specific way, it was activated not by the asset himself, but by a secondary beacon registered to a piece of equipment the asset had loaned to a dependent. Torres read the GPS coordinates again, confirmed them against a civilian map, saw the words Fairview Heights Municipal Police Department, and reached for the red phone. The fluorescent lights in the Fairview Heights precinct booking room had been buzzing at a frequency slightly below the threshold of conscious annoyance for so long that the officers who worked there had stopped hearing it years ago, the way you stop hearing the refrigerator hum in your kitchen. But Marcus heard it because Marcus had never been in this room before, and the buzz was part of the experience of the room, along with the smell of industrial cleaning fluid over old linoleum, over something older underneath, that the cleaning fluid had never quite reached, and the hard brightness of the light that was the opposite of the soft, rain-blurred street lamps outside, and that made everyone in the room look slightly unwell. Pruitt was at his desk with his 2 index fingers moving across the keyboard in the slow, deliberate hunt and peck of a man who has been typing this way for 17 years and has no intention of changing, and he was constructing the arrest report with the unhurried confidence of someone writing a document that will never be seriously questioned, building the narrative, the way he had built hundreds of narratives before. Erratic driving, suspicious behavior, matching description, discovered in possession of refused lawful orders, and all of it assembled with the internal grammar of official documentation that makes improvised fiction sound like established fact. He glanced at Marcus periodically, not because Marcus was doing anything, but because looking at Marcus was a form of the same pleasure that had been driving the night since the pharmacy parking lot. The pleasure of a man who has exercised power over someone and is still in the room with the evidence of it, and Marcus was sitting on the wooden bench with his cuffed right wrist resting in his lap and his back straight and his eyes on the middle distance. The stillness that was not submission and that Pruitt read as arrogance, because the only version of stillness he had room for in his understanding was the stillness of someone waiting to be told what to do next. Sharp was at his own desk, and his posture had the particular careful quality of a man maintaining a performance of normalcy, his shoulders set at the angle of someone engaged with their work. But the work on his screen was a civilian internet search for the prefix code on the government asset sticker, and the search was returning nothing, which was to say, it was returning the specific particular nothing that happens when you search for something that does not exist in any civilian database, because it was never entered into one, and that specific nothing was telling Sharp something that he did not have the framework to fully interpret, and that was making him profoundly uncomfortable. Marcus asked for his phone call with the same quiet, measured voice he had used all night, and Pruitt slid the heavy old landline across the desk without looking up, making a remark about public defenders and deadbeat fathers that was designed to land somewhere between cruelty and comedy, and landed exactly there because Pruitt had been calibrating that particular register for 17 years and had the range down precisely. Marcus picked up the receiver and looked at the dial pad, and his expression did not change, and his right hand, still attached to the bench rail by the steel cuff, was resting palm up in his lap, with a steadiness that had been earned over years of a father sitting across a kitchen table and making his son rehearse this moment, the way other fathers make their sons rehearse for Little League tryouts over and over, until the sequence was not a procedure but a reflex. And Marcus began to dial. The number was 14 digits, dialed in a specific cadence that included a 1-second pause after the 7th digit, and the line did not produce the standard ringtone of a civilian telephone connection, but instead offered a tone, then a click, then a synthetic automated voice that requested a clearance protocol in a flat, gender-neutral register that sounded like no phone system Marcus had ever called for any ordinary purpose. He shielded the receiver with his free hand and leaned close to the mouthpiece and spoke quietly, but clearly, the words that his father had made him memorize when Marcus was 12 years old, and that he had filed in the same internal drawer as fire evacuation routes and the location of the first aid kit. Things you memorize with the sincere hope that the memorization is the only time you will ever need them. A call sign, a personal identifier code, a status designation. The address his name, and then he set the receiver down and pushed the phone back across the desk. Pruitt had been watching with the expression of a man watching something mildly entertaining during a commercial break, and the laugh came as expected. The short, dismissive sound and the question about video games and whether Marcus had called anyone at all, and Marcus looked at the wall and said, "My father, he will be here shortly." And Pruitt laughed again and returned to his typing. Sharp said nothing. He was looking at the photograph on his phone and thinking about the cost of the next decision he was going to have to make, and already understanding, in a quiet part of himself, that he would have preferred to keep quiet. That doing nothing was also a decision, and that doing nothing carried its own cost, and that the time for the easier version of this choice had already passed. In Langley, Torres had the transmission within 40 seconds of the call terminating, and Calvin Webb's file opened on his terminal, like the biography of a different kind of person. 22 years of service, 6 overseas postings, operational involvement in events that were referenced by code name rather than description, domestic reassignment. 18 months ago, under the cover identity of a regional logistics director, married, 1 son, 17 STEM scholarship student at Fairview Heights Academy, and the emergency contact information on the family protocol listed a secure line with a number that Torres was now dialing on the red phone, and somewhere in a house in Fairview Heights, in a home office with a clean desk and a bookshelf arranged to look unremarkable. A matte black device that was not a phone anyone could buy at a store pulsed red in the dark. The home office smelled like the specific quiet of a man who works in secrets, which is to say it smelled like nothing in particular because the deliberate absence of distinguishing characteristics was itself a discipline. No candles, no coffee from an open mug, no papers left out overnight. The desk clean at the end of every day, with the practiced precision of someone who has internalized the difference between a comfortable workspace and a workspace that tells a story to anyone who sees it. Calvin Webb was 44 years old and had been sitting at this desk for 3 hours reviewing a document that he would be obligated to describe to his neighbors as shipping logistics projections, and the document was nothing of the kind. And he was good at this life, the maintenance of 2 simultaneous versions of himself. The version that attended school events and knew the names of Marcus's teachers and grilled salmon on Sunday evenings, and the version that had spent 22 years making decisions in the gray areas of geopolitics, where the cost of a wrong choice was measured in ways that did not appear in any ledger that a civilian would recognize. The matte black device on the corner of his desk pulsed red. Calvin had not seen that pulse in 3 years, and his body responded to it before his mind had finished registering what it was, the way a trained response always precedes conscious processing, and he had the receiver in his hand before the second pulse completed. Torres delivered the information with the efficient precision of a duty officer who has been trained to deliver bad news to high-clearance personnel without editorial code, Blue Family Emergency Protocol. Activated. Marcus's location confirmed as Fairview Heights Municipal Police Department. Module breach confirmed. Anti-tamper failsafe activated memory wipe in progress. And the detail about the module's anti-tamper casing being breached by forced manual access. There were 2 things happening inside Calvin Webb at that moment running in parallel, and the first was the operational assessment. Clean and rapid and impersonal processing. The breach, the protocol, the legal implications, the response chain, the personnel to be contacted, the sequence of actions required and their correct order. And the second was the thing that cannot be trained out of a person, regardless of how many years they spend training it, which was the image of his son's wrists in handcuffs and the sound of an arrest report being typed in a room where Marcus was sitting alone, and the operational track won because it had to, because the only way to help Marcus was to be the version of himself that could help Marcus. He gave Torres 3 instructions in a flat, even voice: activate the Domestic Rapid Response Protocol through the Regional FBI Field Office. Contact the DOJ Civil Rights Night Liaison and place a call to the personal cell phone of Captain Roy Simmons of the Fairview Heights Municipal Police Department. Not the precinct line, the personal cell, so that Simmons would understand before Calvin arrived that this was not a phone call from a concerned parent. He dressed quickly, dark tactical jacket over a clean gray shirt, and then he paused at the door of Marcus's bedroom, which he had not planned to do, his hand coming to rest on the doorframe in a way that was not deliberate but was not casual either. His palm flat against the wood as if he needed a moment to feel something solid before he went back to being the other version of himself. He stood there longer than he intended, looking at the room where his son lived, his ordinary, extraordinary life. The robotics textbooks stacked in the order of the courses. They corresponded to the team photograph from last year's regional competition, pinned to the corkboard above the desk. The first drone prototype Marcus had built at 13, hanging from the ceiling on a fishing line, lopsided and brave and completely functional despite the lopsidedness, which had always seemed to Calvin like a fair description of his son in general. He took his hand off the door frame. He closed the door quietly, the way you close a door when the person inside is sleeping and you do not want to disturb them, even though the room was empty, and then he walked to his car, and the rain was still falling over Fairview Heights, and it did not know what was coming. The precinct door opened at 1:47, and nobody in the room heard it open, because it opened at a completely normal speed with a completely normal amount of force, and the absence of drama was somehow more alarming than any entrance that announced itself, because the people who arrived through that door arrived with the complete absence of the need to announce themselves, which is its own kind of announcement. 3 individuals entered first, moving with the specific economy of people who have already decided where they are going and what they will do when they get there, and have no remaining attention to spend on performance, and the credentials appeared briefly in the direction of Officer Sharp, and then disappeared back into jacket pockets with the efficiency of people who have produced credentials a sufficient number of times that the gesture is reflexive rather than deliberate. Calvin Webb came through the door behind them. He was broad-shouldered and still with a close-cropped beard and gray at his temples that had come in early, the way gray comes for men who spend their 40s carrying invisible weight. And his face in that moment was not angry and not frightened and not performed in any direction. It was simply present in the specific way that very few faces ever are fully occupied and fully controlled, and his eyes moved across the room once in a motion so smooth and complete that it looked almost casual, but was not casual at all. It was the scan of a man who had been assessing rooms for 2 decades and had done it so many times that the threat matrix resolved in under 2 seconds without requiring any visible effort. Pruitt was on his feet. The thumb moved toward the belt buckle. the reflex of 17 years, but it stopped halfway arrested in transit because something in Calvin's presence had interrupted the reflex before it could complete, and Pruitt's hand hung at an awkward angle that was neither the confident hook over the buckle nor a natural resting position. Just a hand stopped in the middle of doing something by the arrival of a reason not to finish it. Calvin walked past Pruitt without acknowledgement. Past Sharp, past the booking desk directly to the wooden bench where Marcus was sitting with his cuffed wrist in his lap, and he crouched down in front of his son and examined Marcus's wrists where the steel had left its marks. The redness livid against Marcus's dark skin, and the look on Calvin's face when he saw those marks was the most dangerous thing that had been in that room all night. Not because it was rage, but because it was something colder and more precise than rage. The expression of a man who has just been handed an invoice and intends to pay every line item. He said to Marcus quietly, "Are you hurt?" And Marcus said, "No, sir, just tired." And Calvin said, "Did you activate the full protocol?" And Marcus said, "Yes." And Calvin put one hand on Marcus's shoulder for exactly 3 seconds, a duration that communicated more in its precision than most embraces communicate in their duration. And then he stood and turned. Pruitt found his voice, which required a visible effort, and demanded to know who Calvin was, and told him to step away from the prisoner, and before he could add anything to that, the precinct's phone lines began. All of them simultaneously, the main line and the secondary line and the captain's direct line and the dispatch line all ringing at once in an overlapping cacophony that nobody had ever heard before in that building, and that filled the fluorescent-lit room with the particular unmistakable sound of a situation that had passed beyond the control of anyone currently present. Captain Roy Simmons came out of the back office holding a phone receiver against his chest, with both hands, his face the color of old primer, and looked at Calvin. And Calvin looked back at him with the neutral appraising expression of someone who already knows everything they need to know about a person and is simply confirming it. Calvin said Pruitt's name, reading it from the badge not as a question, and then he stated what had happened in the tone of a man reading an established record rather than making an accusation, illegal traffic stop illegal. Search and seizure, unlawful detention of a minor. Forced tampering with classified federal property, and Pruitt's mouth was moving, but no sound was being produced, and Pruitt's mind was doing something terrible and involuntary, replaying the night in a sequence that was arriving now not as a series of satisfying assertions of authority, but as a documentary of a federal crime. The case landing on the wet asphalt, his own hands on the latches, the slow, deliberate pause before he opened them while watching Marcus's face for the reaction. The warmth in his chest when he saw Marcus's jaw tighten, and every pleasurable memory was arriving now as evidence transformed by context into something that would be read aloud in a courtroom, and the blood was leaving Pruitt's face in a visible wave, and his hands fell open at his sides in the involuntary posture of a man trying to grab onto something that is not there, and there was nothing there. Calvin nodded to one of the federal agents who produced a key and removed Marcus's cuffs in a single practiced motion, and Marcus stood and rubbed his wrists and moved to stand beside his father and Dale. Pruitt looked at the boy he had believed was the easiest caller of the month and understood in a way that arrived all at once and could not be undone that he had never been the apex predator he believed himself to be, that he had been the largest thing in a very small pond for 17 years without ever once considering whether a larger pond existed, and that the answer to that question had just walked through his front door. Calvin addressed Simmons before he addressed anyone else in the room because the captain was the structure through which every complaint against Pruitt had flowed and been absorbed and redirected into nothing, and dismantling the structure required identifying the load-bearing walls, and Simmons was one of them. He did not raise his voice, which was more effective than raising it would have been, because a raised voice gives a person something to react to, and Calvin was not interested in giving Simmons anything to react to, and he told Simmons in the conversational register of someone describing a logistical arrangement that had already been made that the Fairview Heights Municipal Police Department was, as of this moment, under federal administrative oversight, that the county sheriff's department had assumed patrol responsibility for the municipality, a handover Calvin had arranged 20 minutes before walking through the precinct door, and that Simmons's cooperation with the federal process was not optional, but was something Simmons could choose to make easier on himself by providing it genuinely rather than being compelled to provide it under formal obstruction proceedings. Simmons nodded in the way that a man nods when he has no viable alternative to nodding. Agent Dana Holt arrived with the second team at 1:53, and they went to 3 locations simultaneously: the evidence lockup, the precinct server room, and the desk where Pruitt's patrol cruiser logs were maintained, beginning the work of seizing records with the methodical precision of people who understand that the value of evidence is determined entirely by the integrity of how it is collected. Every screen in the building transitioned to the federal seal at 1:57, the screens going red in sequence from the dispatch desk to the booking area to the captain's office to the break room, and the effect on the officers who were still present was visible and immediate in the way that a power being cut is immediately visible in a room full of people who were relying on it. Faces going, still hands becoming uncertain about where to rest. The group chat was pulled from the precinct server in the first 11 minutes, and when Holt reviewed the summary of what it contained, she showed it to Calvin without comment, and Calvin read it and showed it to Raymond Okafor. The DOJ civil rights attorney, who had appeared quietly at 2:15 in a winter coat over a dress shirt, and Okafor opened his legal pad and began making notes in a small, precise handwriting that covered the page in dense rows. 12 officers, 3 years of documented activity, a vocabulary for describing residents that would end every career. It touched a point system for stops, a shared archive of tactics for disabling dashcam audio during arrests, and at the top of the member list, the handle that everyone in the chat knew belonged to Dale Pruitt, with a stop count that led the current monthly standings by 19. Sharp was standing near the water cooler at the far end of the room, and he looked at the photograph on his phone one more time, and he thought about what doing nothing cost. And he thought about what Kevin Sharp's name would look like on a federal indictment. And he crossed the room to Agent Holt and handed her the phone with the image already on the screen and told her he had been present during the stop and the arrest, and that he was prepared to give a full account of everything he had witnessed, and declined to question over 2 years of working beside Pruitt because he understood that the time for the easier version of this choice was gone, and the only version left was the one he was making now. Dale Pruitt had been placed in a chair in the far corner of the booking room, not in a cell not yet formally charged, but occupying the chair with the specific quality of a man who has become stationary. Not because he is waiting for something, but because forward motion has become conceptually unavailable, and the room moved around him with the organized professional activity of a process that did not require his participation to proceed. No one was performing for Pruitt. That was the thing that was most difficult to process, that the federal agents and the DOJ attorney and the man who had walked in and rearranged the entire structure of his authority were not performing for him in any direction. Not with anger, not with contempt, not with the triumphant satisfaction that would have been easier to bear than this. They were simply working with the impersonal efficiency of professionals executing a procedure, and Pruitt was not the center of the procedure. He was the subject of it, which was a distinction that 17 years of uncontested authority had not prepared him to inhabit. He looked at Marcus. Marcus was sitting on the same bench Pruitt had shackled him to 90 minutes ago, but the cuffs were gone, and Marcus was watching the federal process with the calm, attentive eyes of someone observing something they have been told to expect and are now confirming. And his posture was what it had been all night, straight and composed and entirely unbowed, and Pruitt realized with a specific nauseating quality of recognition that the stillness he had read all night as arrogance was not arrogance at all. It was a form of preparation, the stillness of someone who knew something Pruitt had not known and had been waiting for the knowing to arrive. The memory came without invitation, arriving in the specific physical textures that the mind prefers for its most damaging deliveries. The satisfying sound of the equipment case hitting wet asphalt. The warmth in his chest. When he saw Marcus's jaw tighten, the deliberate 3-second pause with his fingers on the latches while he watched Marcus's face. The small smile he had permitted himself in that moment. The pleasure of it, and every pleasurable memory arrived now with a federal charge number attached, transformed by context into something that would be read aloud in a courtroom and considered by a judge and entered into a permanent record. And Dale Pruitt, for the first time in a very long time, could not manufacture the version of himself that found any of this manageable. He looked at Calvin Webb, who was across the room with his back half-turned, speaking quietly with Agent Holt over a document on her tablet, and Calvin was not watching Pruitt. And that was the deepest wound of the freeze moment, because in every encounter Pruitt had engineered for 17 years, he had been the person who decided when the other person stopped being worth watching, and now the roles had reversed in a way that felt absolute and irreversible, and Pruitt was peripheral, and the federal machinery did not orbit him, it simply processed him. The police union representative arrived at 2:30 and did not sit down, which communicated the nature of the visit before any words were exchanged, and he dropped a folder on the table beside Pruitt's chair and told him in the flat, bureaucratic cadence of a man severing a relationship that had become a liability that the union was not in a position to fund a defense for a Federal Espionage Act violation, that the bylaws were explicit on the matter, and that this was the last official interaction the union would be having with him in any capacity. Pruitt reached reflexively for his belt buckle, the thumb moving toward the old gesture out of 17 years of muscle memory, and his thumb hooked the air where the buckle was and found it, and then stopped arrested by the recognition that the gesture had nowhere to go anymore, that the room it was designed for no longer existed. And his hand came down, and his shoulders rounded forward, and he sat with his hands clasped between his knees and looked at the floor. And Dale Pruitt was a man at a bus stop with nowhere left to go. Agent Holt came back from the evidence room at 2:44, carrying a department tablet, and she set it on the booking desk and navigated to an audio file that had been isolated and enhanced from the dash cam footage of Pruitt's cruiser, and she played a 20-second clip through the tablet's speaker at a volume sufficient for the room to hear clearly. Pruitt's voice captured in the interior of his own cruiser before he had even activated his light bar, speaking to himself in the private register of a man narrating his own authority to an empty car. "Not in my town, not at this hour." And then the same clip from the window. The same words delivered to Marcus's face after Marcus had explained that he was a scholarship student returning from a school project. And then the same words a third time at the moment of the arrest. Each instance time-stamped, each instance, clean and unambiguous. The same phrase used at the beginning and middle and end of an encounter that had produced no contraband, no valid traffic violation, and no legitimate probable cause. Raymond Okafor listened to the clip twice, listening the way a surgeon listens to a diagnostic result, and then he made a single note on his legal pad and said to Holt in a voice that was quiet and final, "That is the opener," and Holt nodded, and Calvin, who had been listening from near the window, looked at the tablet with an expression that was not satisfaction, only the particular neutrality of a man confirming what he already knew was there. The formal arrest of Dale Pruitt began at 3:07 in the morning, and Dana Holt performed it without drama, without a speech, without any additional communication beyond what was procedurally required, which was itself the most complete humiliation Pruitt had experienced in the entire night, because he had been humiliating people with drama and speeches for 17 years. And there was nothing in the impersonal competence of this woman's professionalism that he could push against. The leitmotif completed its final performance instead of Pruitt's thumb hooking over his own belt buckle in the gesture that had preceded every exercise of his authority for 17 years. Holt's hand closed around Pruitt's wrist and pulled it behind his back. The motion mirror reversed and the cuffs closed with the same sharp metallic click that had opened the story, the same sound that Pruitt had used as a punctuation mark for 17 years of power, arriving now as the last sentence of that story. The charges were read in full, and the list was long, and each item landed in the fluorescent-lit room with the weight of a thing that had been accumulating for 17 years and was now being presented in its complete documented form. Deprivation of civil rights under color of law. unauthorized tampering with classified federal property, destruction of classified government material, conspiracy to violate civil rights in connection with the documented group chat, and Pruitt attempted one final performance, raising his voice, calling it a setup, invoking his years of service, demanding a union representative who had already been there and already left, and no one in the room responded. The walk to the federal vehicle was through the front doors of the precinct, the same doors Pruitt had walked through with authority for 17 years, and the rain had stopped, and the parking lot was wet and quiet. And across the street a news van was already setting up because the media protocol had begun releasing information to the regional bureau, and by morning the story would be complete. Marcus stood in the doorway and watched Pruitt being walked to the black federal SUV, and he did not call after him and did not gloat. And what was on his face was not triumph, but the quiet, clear-eyed pity of someone who sees a person exactly as that person is stripped of every story they have told about themselves, and finds that the truth is smaller and sadder than the story was. The mayor's office occupied the corner of the third floor of the Fairview Heights Municipal Building, and had been designed to communicate unassailable position through the physical vocabulary of permanence and substance mahogany desk, with the proportions of something that had not been carried into the room so much as built within it, framed photographs arranged to show the mayor at moments of official proximity to people with more authority than him, a window with a view of the town's central green, that on a clear day produced the impression of surveying a territory rather than administering a municipality. Mayor Gerald Whitmore was 62 years old and had governed Fairview Heights for 9 years on the twin foundations of a real estate developer's instinct for what people wanted to hear and a career politician's instinct for how to make hearing it the entirety of the transaction. And he had his smile calibrated and his hand extended before Calvin was fully through the door, because men like Whitmore treat the management of uncomfortable situations as a hospitality problem. Calvin did not take the hand. He sat in the chair across from the mahogany desk without being invited to sit, and he placed a thin black folder on the desk without opening it, and Agent Holt took the chair to his left, and Raymond Okafor remained standing, which had the effect of making the room feel smaller and more formal than Whitmore had intended. Simmons was already in the room in a chair against the wall, with the posture of a man who has spent all night being processed by something larger than himself, and arrived at the morning in a state of complete collapse, and he did not speak for the duration of the meeting. Whitmore's opening was practiced. Pruitt had been terminated as of 6 that morning. A settlement figure in the 7-figure range was available to Marcus's family immediately. The city was prepared to cooperate, and surely there was a version of this that did not require the federal government to occupy the municipal police department. Okafor opened the folder and laid 3 documents on the mahogany desk: the full transcript of the group chat, a summary of the 9 internal affairs complaints against Pruitt that had been reviewed, signed, and closed by Captain Roy Simmons, without finding, and a 10-year demographic analysis of traffic stops in the South Corridor of Fairview Heights, presented not as a study, but as a plain table of numbers. The percentage of minority drivers stopped in the corridor against the percentage of minority drivers in the corridor's overall traffic year by year, each year signed off by the department's command staff. The smile left Whitmore's face in stages the way a light dims before it goes dark. Calvin told him what the consent decree meant in plain terms: federal receivership and independent monitor with full operational authority over the department for 10 years, mandatory recertification of every officer, real-time federal audit of South Corridor, stops a community oversight board with genuine subpoena power. And Whitmore pushed back once with the language of local sovereignty and taxpayer costs. And Calvin told him that the alternative was a criminal obstruction referral and a closer examination of the zoning approval records from Whitmore's private development company, and Whitmore agreed to full cooperation in under 90 seconds. The federal indictment of Dale Pruitt was a document of considerable length, and every length of it had been earned. The charges were specific, and their consequences were specific. The civil rights deprivation carried a mandatory minimum measured in years. The unauthorized tampering with classified federal property carried its own federal weight. The destruction of classified government material added to the structure of the case, and the conspiracy charge connecting the documented group chat to a pattern of coordinated civil rights violations over 3 years involving 12 officers built the case into something that no single plea deal could dismantle without the cooperation of multiple defendants. The 12 officers in the group chat were processed separately. 6 accepted federal plea agreements in the first 3 weeks and received sentences ranging from 2 to 4 years, and 6 chose to contest and were permanently stripped of their law enforcement certifications by order of the federal court, a consequence that functioned as a permanent professional death, barring them from wearing a badge anywhere in the country for the remainder of their lives. Sharp's cooperation had been complete and early, and in recognition of that cooperation, he received a supervised release agreement with mandatory retraining, retaining his freedom but losing his position at Fairview Heights and being reassigned to a rural county department under a 2-year probationary status, an outcome that was not easy and was not meant to be. Simmons received no criminal charges but the civil liability judgment arising from the documented pattern of burying complaints over 9 years cost him a substantial portion of the pension he had spent 17 years accumulating, and the pension review proceedings were public because Okafor had made them public because the public nature of the consequence was part of what made it a consequence, rather than an administrative adjustment. Whitmore signed the consent decree on a Tuesday morning in front of 3 local television cameras, flanked by federal monitors and Okafor, and the photograph ran on the front page of every regional newspaper, and the development company's permit applications for 3 planned projects were denied under the new oversight regime. The new federal monitor was a former civil rights attorney from Atlanta named Bernard Cole, demanding and methodical, who in his first week of oversight terminated 4 additional officers identified in a secondary review of the server data and established a community oversight board that held its first public meeting 2 weeks after his appointment. The Albert Faison Federal Courthouse in the district capital was built in the era when federal buildings were designed to communicate the permanence of the institutions they housed. All marble and high ceilings and the cool climate-controlled air, carrying the smell of old paper, and something that was not quite silence, but was the particular absence of improvisation, and it was the opposite of the Fairview Heights precinct in every physical register, where the precinct had smelled of burnt coffee and old linoleum. The federal courthouse smelled of permanence and the complete absence of the kind of casual authority that Dale Pruitt had spent 17 years mistaking for the real thing. The air in courtroom 4 was cold, and still the overhead lights casting a flat, even illumination that left no shadows and no ambiguity. And the gallery was full in a way that the arraignment had not been, because the story had traveled in the months between, and it had traveled the way stories travel when they contain something that a great many people have been waiting to see confirmed. In the 4th row sat 8 of the families who had filed the 9 internal affairs complaints against Pruitt that Simmons had buried many of them, seeing Pruitt in handcuffs for the first time after years of being told that their accounts were insufficient and their complaints were unfounded, and that the department's review had found no basis for action. And they were sitting with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have been waiting a long time for a room to be ready for them. Dale Pruitt sat at the defendant's table in the standard issue orange of a federal detainee, and the uniform did something specific to a man who had spent 17 years using his appearance as an instrument of power. And what the orange did was remove all of that in a single transaction, leaving only the person and the person absent. His apparatus was a thickening man in his mid-40s with an uncertain posture, and hands that did not know what to do with themselves in the absence of a belt buckle to anchor them. The union representative was not in the gallery, and Pruitt scanned for him 3 times before accepting that absence as the final clean severance of the relationship he had counted on. Judge Patricia Sands came to the bench with the economy of movement of someone who does not spend energy on theatrics settling into her chair with the authority of a judge who has seen enough of both guilt and performance to find neither one interesting. And she looked at Pruitt over her reading glasses with the expression of a woman who has reviewed his file and found it sufficient for her purposes. Raymond Okafor did not begin with an argument. He was a man who understood that the most devastating thing a prosecutor can do in the right case with the right evidence is remove themselves from between the evidence and the audience and allow the evidence to speak in its own voice. And he was standing at the podium with the stillness of someone who has nothing to be nervous about, because he has nothing to prove that the recording will not prove more effectively than anything he could say. And he addressed the court in the quiet, methodical tone of a man who knows exactly where he is going and is not in a hurry to get there. The government intends to demonstrate. Okafor said that what Officer Dale Pruitt did on the night in question was not an error in judgment, not a miscalculation, not a mistake made under pressure, but the expression of a philosophy that he had stated repeatedly, consistently, and on the record. A philosophy that governed not only this stop, but the pattern of stops that the documentary evidence would show had characterized his 17-year career, and the government would present that evidence, beginning with Officer Pruitt's own voice. He nodded to the court's audio technician, and the first clip played. The sound that filled the room was Pruitt's own voice, recorded in the interior of his cruiser at 11:46 in the evening, speaking to himself in the private register of a man narrating his authority to an empty car. And the words were not in my town, not at this hour. The courtroom was silent in a way that courtrooms rarely achieve, a cold, total silence that settled over the gallery and the bench and the defendant's table like a change in air pressure. And in that silence the words sat in the room with a weight that they had not carried when Pruitt first said them, because when Pruitt first said them they were a private pleasure and now they were a public confession. Okafor waited, then nodded again, and the second clip played the same voice, the same words delivered to Marcus's face at the driver's window after Marcus had explained that he was a scholarship student returning from a school project, and the gallery heard in that second clip not just the words but the tone of them, the comfortable warmth of a man saying something he has said many times and finds familiar. The third clip, the same words spoken at the moment of the arrest. Not in anger, not in urgency, but with the specific satisfaction of a man completing a sentence. He began 3 miles back on a rainy road. Not in my town, not at this hour, and definitely not with this. Okafor did not editorialize because the evidence did not need editorializing, and he told the court simply that all 3 instances used identical language, that the first instance occurred before Pruitt had initiated the stop, and before any interaction with Marcus had taken place, and before any claim of suspicious behavior could even be constructed, and that the phrase repeated at the beginning and middle and end of an encounter that produced no contraband, no valid violation, and no legitimate probable cause was the key to the government's argument about what kind of stop this had been and what kind of officer had made it. The defense objection was overruled. Judge Sands looked at Pruitt over her reading glasses with an expression that was not anger and not contempt, but something that incorporated both without being reducible to either the expression of someone who has recognized a pattern she has seen too many times and has run out of the patience that would have been required to be surprised by it. And Pruitt looked at the grain of the defense table and pressed his palms flat against the cool wood, and did not look at the gallery where the families of his 9 buried complaints were watching him with expressions that contained years of waiting for exactly this. The bail motion was denied for reasons that the judge enumerated in full, and Pruitt was remanded to the custody of the United States Marshals, and the chains on his ankles made a sound in the silent courtroom as he was led toward the side door. A sound that was small and metallic and continuous, and the families in the 4th row heard it, and several of them closed their eyes. 6 months after the arraignment, Dale Pruitt's attorney entered into plea negotiations with Raymond Okafor, a development that was not surprising, given the volume and quality of the evidence, and the negotiations proceeded for 3 weeks before arriving at an agreement. In exchange for the Espionage Act charge being dropped from the proceedings, which the CIA strongly preferred, because taking that charge to public trial would have required introducing details about the classified module into a public record in a way that the Directorate of Operations found unacceptable. Pruitt entered guilty pleas to multiple counts of federal civil rights violations and 1 count of destruction of classified government material. Judge Sands sentenced him to 16 years in the Federal Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland, with a provision that parole eligibility would not be considered for the first 12 years, given the premeditated and patterned nature of the civil rights violations and the documented group conspiracy, and Pruitt stood at sentencing in the orange jumpsuit with the stillness of a man who has been processing an outcome for 6 months and has arrived at the moment of its formalization in a state somewhere beyond resistance. He did not speak. The judge did not invite him to. His pension was forfeited in full under the terms of the federal civil rights conviction, and the court directed the forfeited funds by order to a civil rights legal defense fund serving the families of wrongful stops in the regional area. $214,000 a number that was stated in the order and reported in the press, and the families of the 9 buried complaints saw the number and knew what it represented. 3 of the 9 families had pursued separate civil suits against the city of Fairview Heights before Pruitt's sentencing, and all 3 had settled for named amounts before the sentencing date, and the settlements were reported alongside the sentencing in the local press in a pairing that had the structure of a conclusion. The gymnasium of Fairview Heights Academy had the particular atmosphere of a space that has been pressed into a purpose. It was not designed for the rubber and chalk smell of a room built for athletic competition, now carrying the additional charge of competitive engineering. Folding tables arranged in rows on the basketball court. Laptop screens glowing in the fluorescent overhead light, the high-frequency energy of teenagers who have worked for months toward a single afternoon. Marcus was at the testing table with his 2 teammates, Devin, the team's programmer compact, and perpetually in motion running final diagnostics on the flight controller, and Priya, the structural designer, who had been up until 2 in the morning reinforcing the drone's undercarriage after a stress test had flagged a potential vulnerability, and who was now reviewing her own notes with the particular calm of someone who has done everything that can be done and has arrived at peace with whatever follows. The equipment case was open on the table, and inside it, the gyroscopic stabilization module was a commercial unit Marcus had sourced and installed in the 48 hours following the night of the stop, working from specifications he had compiled himself, because the original module's exact performance profile was not replicated by anything available through normal channels. And the replacement was good, but without the precision of the original. Their wind compensation had dropped by a margin that was not catastrophic, but was not invisible, and Marcus had spent the intervening days in the lab recalibrating the flight control algorithm manually to compensate, working with the focused patience of a boy who has learned to treat obstacles as engineering problems rather than verdicts. In the stands in the upper row of the east bleachers, Calvin Webb was holding a cup of concession stand coffee that had been terrible when it was hot and was now terrible and cold, wearing a navy sweater and slacks, looking completely like every other parent in the gym and completely unlike every other parent in the gym in a way that was visible only if you knew what you were looking for, which was the quality of stillness he maintained in a space full of normal parental restlessness. The way his eyes moved every few minutes across the exits and the floor, in a scan that was so practiced it barely registered as movement. In his right ear, the nearly invisible comlink delivered the live audio from the federal courthouse, and he listened to Raymond Okafor's voice describing the plea agreement, and Judge Sands reading the sentence 16 years federal facility parole eligibility, not for 12 years, and the chains on Pruitt's ankles making a sound as he was led away, and Calvin listened to all of it in the gymnasium bleachers above a high school robotics tournament with the coffee going cold in his hand. And when the feed went quiet, he tapped the comm piece once and set it to standby and turned his full attention to the floor. Marcus's team was called to the testing arena, and Marcus carried the drone to the pilot's box with the careful, easy confidence of someone who has handled a thing so many times that the weight of it is simply part of his body's understanding of the world. And he stood in the box with the controller and looked at the course, and Devin's voice came through the team headset with the diagnostics, and Priya gave him the wind readings from the sensors at the tunnel entrance. And Marcus said, "We are good. Let's fly." The drone lifted clean. The first set of obstacles went without difficulty, the flight path clean and precise, and when the wind tunnel section arrived and the industrial fans kicked on and the drone took a hard lateral dip to the left, Marcus did not freeze and did not overcorrect. He anticipated the vector and angled the rotors into the force, and the drone fought the current for 3 full seconds. That felt longer than 3 seconds to everyone watching, and then it punched through the exit of the tunnel and leveled out over the final approach, and Marcus brought it down dead center on the landing pad with the controlled deceleration of someone who has done this enough times in his head that the physical execution is almost a formality. The announcer called the time and the position, and Devin and Priya hit Marcus from both sides simultaneously in the particular full-body celebration that people who have been working towards something for months produce when the something finally goes right. And Marcus let himself be celebrated. Let the noise and the motion and the relief wash over him, and then he looked up into the stands. Calvin was looking at him, and he gave Marcus the single slow nod. The acknowledgement between two people who understand each other across the distance of what they have both been through and what they have both held, and Marcus held it for a moment, and then smiled wide and real and entirely 17 years old. Dale Pruitt spent his first winter at the Federal Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland, in a concrete room that was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, and in the mornings, in the specific unguarded moment between sleep and full waking, his right thumb would move toward his belt buckle out of 17 years of muscle memory before the waking completed, and the buckle was not there, and had not been there for months, and would not be there for 12 years, at the earliest. And the habit would take a long time to leave him. But the badge was already gone completely, and that was the one that had always mattered more. On the first Tuesday of the month, the Community Oversight Board held its meeting in the same precinct basement where Marcus had been shackled to a bench, and the room was full, every seat taken. And the new cameras on the patrol cruisers blinked their red recording lights over the South Corridor streets, transmitting to a server in Washington that nobody in Fairview Heights could touch, and the bulletin board in the precinct lobby listed 13 names, and nobody had taken it down and nobody was going to. Marcus Webb stood in a dormitory room at MYT on a Tuesday evening in October, the aerial mapping drone assembled on his desk in its new configuration, upgraded and improved and carrying none of the weight of the night that had tried to prevent him from reaching this room. And his phone buzzed once on the desk, beside him a text from his father. 3 words, no punctuation, the compressed language of a man who measures his words because he was trained to. And Marcus read it and set the phone face down and looked out the window at the Boston skyline at the full distance between here and everything that had tried to stop him from arriving at it, and then he picked up his tools and got back to work. If this story moved you, if you felt that surge of justice when the truth finally caught up to the cruelty, then hit that like button right now, because it tells us that stories like this matter to you, and it helps us bring more of them to people who need to hear them. Share this video with someone in your life, a parent, a friend, a young person who needs to know that dignity is not something that can be taken permanently. It can be delayed, but it always finds its way back. Subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss the next story, because we have more coming and every single one is worth your time. And drop a comment below and tell us the moment that hit you hardest. We read every one, and your voice in that comment section is part of what keeps this community alive. We will see you in the next one. We will see you.